welcome back to the ancient world. Last week, we journeyed to the most improbable places. From Norte Chico in the Peruvian desert, the civilization that built pyramids contemporary with Egypt, to the vibrant and mysterious Minoan Crete, a society without warfare. But while those isolated civilizations were quietly developing, a new game began in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. This game wasn't just about building cities, it was about building empires. Imagine this. A man cast adrift on the Euphrates River in a reed basket, raised by a humble gardener. That man, who would become known as Sargon, did something unprecedented. He conquered the entirety of the chaotic Sumerian city-states, forging a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. How did a gardener's son become the world's first emperor? What ruthless tactics did he employ? And why did his legacy haunt Near Eastern rulers for the next 2 millennia? This is the story of power, myth, and the spectacular collapse of an empire built on bronze and blood. Ready to find out? The Ancient Compass starts now. Last episode found us journeying across the vast Atlantic to bear witness to the rise of the Norte Chico culture in Peru. Undeniably the earliest civilization to put down roots in what's ironically dubbed the New World. Then, we zipped back to Europe to delve into the enigmas surrounding the henge builders of Neolithic Britain and the sweeping cultural impact of Minoan Crete. This week, I'm pivoting our attention back to Mesopotamia, zeroing in on the action-packed stretch between 2700 and 2000 BC. And wouldn't you just know it? The moment we leave them alone for a single podcast, those darn Sumerians are at it again, brawling and squabbling like there's no tomorrow. As we've touched upon before, Sumerian city-states had expanded to swallow up the surrounding farmland, and simmering tensions had started to boil over at the boundaries separating rival territories. The southern cities of Lagash and Umma, in particular, were locked in a long-standing grudge match, with an inscription from King Eannatum of Lagash declaring, "If a man from Umma dares to cross the boundary canal, may Enlil smite him. May Ningursu, after unleashing his mighty battle net, pin him to the ground. And may the people of his own city, rising up in revolt, butcher him in the very heart of their city." It's safe to say, no trespassing signs were a tad more forceful back in the day. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the cities of Uruk and Ur had been locked in a centuries-long tug-of-war for supremacy over Sumer. Finally, around 2400 BC, the city of Lagash, flexing its muscles, conquered them both, along with all the other city-states, forging the first cohesive Sumerian kingdom, even if it was one hammered together and kept intact purely by brute force. Eannatum, the Lagash king responsible for this conquest, is probably best remembered for his stele of the vultures. This stele, commissioned to trumpet the king's victory over the city of Umma, depicts vultures soaring off with the severed heads of his enemies, and it was clearly intended to strike terror into the hearts of anyone contemplating opposition to his rule. The stele also serves as a treasure trove of information about the character of early Sumerian warfare. For instance, it just so happens to include the earliest known depiction of soldiers equipped with spears, helmets, and full-body shields, arranged in the rectangular, masked phalanx formation that would remain a common sight thousands of years later in the Classical Age. Besides spears, Sumerian soldiers also wielded maces, bows, slings, and a relatively cutting-edge invention, the bronze battle axe. The last major weapon to be added to the Near Eastern warrior's arsenal, the curved or sickle sword, would be adapted a bit later, borrowing from a Canaanite design favored by the Assyrians, which itself had evolved from crescent-shaped battle axes. This era also marked the first time the Sumerians started deploying war wagons, pulled by oxen or asses, later replaced by horses, to ferry teams of spearmen and charioteers into the thick of battle. Urukagina, a later Lagash king, gained fame for his judicial, social, and economic reforms, as well as for issuing the earliest known written legal code, predating Hammurabi's by some 500 years. A few examples of his more enlightened rule include exempting widows and orphans from having to pay taxes, the city footing the bill for funerals, including the requisite 3 jugs of beer for libations, capping the interest rates that could be charged on loans, and enacting a law that forbade wealthy men from strong-arming poorer men into selling them their land or property. Urukagina's code is viewed as the first documented instance of government reform, and it appears to have been primarily aimed at reining in what had become widespread abuses by the powerful priesthood and large property owners. A praise poem penned in Urukagina's honor proclaimed that, under his reign, administrators no longer plundered the orchards of the poor. In 2350 BC, a priest-king from the Sumerian city of Umma, named Lugal-Zagasi, overthrew the Lagash dynasty, conquered Uruk, made it his capital, and seized control of Sumer. Meanwhile, further north, another regional power was keeping a close eye on this game of musical chairs, biding its time and waiting for the perfect opportunity to pounce. The Akkadians, whom we briefly mentioned earlier as the ones who would commit the Epic of Gilgamesh to writing in the form we know it today, resided in central Mesopotamia on the eastern bank of the Euphrates and had gradually evolved into rivals of the Sumerians. This northern people and their language were later known as Akkadian, though they weren't actually associated with the city of Akkad, or Agadi, until it became their capital. Eventually, in 2334 BC, with the Sumerians weakened by centuries of bloody internal conflict, the Akkadians sensed their moment of opportunity had arrived. Their ruler at the time was Sargon, the king of Kish, later to be immortalized as Sargon the Great. So you might be starting to get a sense of where things are headed. Sargon is a massively important figure in early Mesopotamian history for a couple of key reasons. First, he's one of the earliest ancient rulers about whom we have a substantial amount of information. Assuming, of course, one can sift through the historical facts and separate them from the mythological embellishments. Secondly, his ambitions and accomplishments not only fundamentally reshaped the landscape of politics and warfare in the region forever, but also served as a source of inspiration for Near Eastern rulers for the next 2 millennia, many of whom openly claim to be emulating his glorious example. So, let's dive a little deeper and see what we can uncover. Stop me if you've heard this one before. A super special child is separated from his parents soon after birth and set adrift until he's discovered and raised by a kind-hearted couple. I'm guessing your mind jumped to either Moses or Superman, right? But in reality, the first individual to come up with this particular secret origin story, at least in retrospect, was Sargon of Akkad. According to the Sargon legend, Sargon was the illegitimate son of a temple priestess who, adhering to the classic heroic mold of Moses or Superman, was cast adrift on the Euphrates in a basket, only to be found and raised by humble parents in the city of Kish. His adoptive father was a gardener entrusted with the crucial task of clearing out and maintaining the city's irrigation canals. Supposedly, Sargon followed in his footsteps. Assuming this is true, this job would have given him access to a disciplined group of workers who might have later formed the nucleus of his first army. Somehow, at some point, Sargon caught the eye of the ruling family of Kish and found himself elevated to the position of cupbearer to the king, Ur-Zababa. Upon the king's death, at whose hands remains a mystery, Sargon swiftly capitalized on his newfound position to seize control of the city. A bit of a departure from the Superman storyline, granted, but hey, this is the ancient Near East we're talking about. Exactly how Sargon pulled off this takeover and what forces he had at his disposal are unknown. But it's pretty clear he understood that, even with Kish under his thumb, his rule was still standing on rather shaky ground. His chosen name, Sargon, translates to true king, which is hardly surprising for an usurper looking to establish a sense of legitimacy. But a name change alone wasn't going to cut it. Sargon needed to give the people what they craved, and in this time and place, that was a strong leader capable of delivering military victories. With his home base secured, he set his sights on the warring city-states of Sumer to the south. Going straight for the jugular, Sargon attacked Uruk, the capital of the current Sumerian ruling dynasty under the priest-king Lugal-Zage-Si. Uruk quickly succumbed to Sargon's army, and legend of Gilgamesh notwithstanding, he had its famed walls razed to the ground for good measure. Lugal-Zage-Si managed to slip out of Uruk and link up with the forces of 50 other Sumerian Ensi, great men from the provinces. In 2 pitched battles, the Akkadians soundly defeated this combined force, eventually capturing Lugal-Zage-Si and dragging him to the city of Nippur, reportedly wearing a dog collar. Ouch. Sargon then pursued his remaining enemies to Ur, before pushing northward to Lagash and then westward to Umma. After securing victories over all these city-states, he made a symbolic gesture of washing his weapons in the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, to signal that his conquest of Sumer was now complete. Following this initial wave of conquests, and with an eye toward limiting the potential for revolt in Sumer, Sargon appointed a court of 5,400 men to share his table, which is to say, administer his conquered territories. These same 5,400 men may well have formed the core of his army. In particular, Akkadian governors were installed to oversee the major city-states of Sumer, with the hope of keeping the notoriously quarrelsome territory in line. The Akkadians spoke a distinct Semitic language and were also a different ethnic group from the Sumerians, whom they referred to as the people with the black hair. Sargon's victories over the Sumerians, therefore, led to the creation of the world's first multi-ethnic empire. This conquest can also be considered the end of purely Sumerian civilization. Though Sumerian culture remained profoundly influential under Akkadian rule, much like the culture of conquered Greece shaped Roman rule in the later classical world. The religious institutions of Sumer, already well known and emulated by the Semites, were respected, maintained, and supported under the new Akkadian regime. Sumerian remained the language of religion, and Sargon and his successors became patrons of the important Sumerian cults. Sargon styled himself anointed priest of Anu and great Ensi of Enlil, and appointed his daughter, Enheduanna, as high priestess of the moon god, Nana, at Ur. In this role, she composed several works in Sumerian, earning herself a prominent place in history as the first identifiable author in world literature. One noteworthy work was a collection of hymns to the temples of 35 Mesopotamian cities, intended as a sort of religious mirroring of the unification her father had achieved through military might. Near the end of this work, she seemed to acknowledge the landmark nature of both accomplishments, writing, "My king, something has been created here that no one has created before." Outside of the religious sphere, the Semitic Akkadian language became the lingua franca of the Near East and was used for all administrative purposes and imperial inscriptions throughout Mesopotamia, a role it would maintain until the rise of Aramaic 1,000 years later. Shortly after securing Sumer, Sargon embarked on a series of campaigns to subjugate the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Akkadians saw themselves as occupying the center of the world, surrounded by the 4 quarters, which included the Amorites, or Martu, who held sway over the lands of Syria and Canaan west of the Euphrates, Subartu to the north, Sumer to the south, and Elam to the east. The Amorite city of Kazalu, located just across the Euphrates from Sargon's home city of Kish, was his first target, and his victory over its king, Megir-Enlil, was both complete and utterly devastating. According to one ancient source, Sargon reduced the city to such a state of desolation that the birds couldn't even find a place to perch off the ground. So, ouch, again. Subsequent yearly invasions against the Amorite cities of Syria and Canaan extended Akkadian influence to the shores of the Mediterranean, perhaps even as far as Cyprus. Moving north and west, Sargon captured the powerful regional cities of Mari, Yarmuti, and Ebla, extending Akkadian influence as far as the Nur Mountains in modern Turkey, and possibly even engaging in battles against the early Hittites, whom we'll discuss in greater detail in a future podcast. These conquests allowed the burgeoning Akkadian Empire to secure trade routes and supplies of wood from Lebanon, as well as precious metals, particularly silver, from Anatolia, which were floated down the Euphrates River to Sargon's new capital of Akkad, whose ruins may lie buried deep beneath modern Baghdad. With the west and northwest under his control, he then turned his attention to the east. Elam at the time was under the Awan dynasty, whose establishment marked the beginning of what's known as the Old Elamite period. Mesopotamian sources regarding Elam become more frequent during this period, as the Sumerians and Akkadians had developed an interest in the resources of the Persian plateau, notably wood, stone, and metal, and military expeditions to the area had become increasingly common. 4 leaders of Elam, under the king of Awan, launched an invasion of the fledgling Akkadian Empire. Sargon decisively crushed the invading army, plundered the Elamite city-states, and turned their kings and governors into vassals of Akkad. He also compelled the Elamites to abandon their Proto-Elamite script in favor of Akkadian cuneiform. Sargon then pressed onward to the east and south, conquering the land of Magan, modern Oman, which was forced to supply the empire with copper for bronze production. In addition to his eastern raids and conquests, Sargon also opened up trade routes to even more distant lands. Inscriptions mention ships from as far afield as Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and Meluha, the Indus Valley civilization, which we'll be discussing soon, mooring in the harbors of Akkad. Finally, to the north, Sargon subjugated Subartu, bringing the last of the 4 quarters of the world under Akkadian rule. So, Sargon, you're now in charge of the known world. What comes next? Well, therein lies the rub. During this era of ancient history, it was exceedingly difficult for conquerors to effectively consolidate their gains. Permanent, standing armies were still a thing of the future. Instead, forces were raised from the local population for yearly campaigns. Therefore, direct rule was rarely imposed. Instead, systems were put in place through which the Akkadians could manage commercial interests, trade routes were monopolized, prime agricultural lands were divvied up among Sargon's favorites, and local elites were recruited to collect taxes on behalf of the imperial power. All of this was underpinned by the constant threat of Akkadian military action. The vast wealth generated by this new imperial system allowed Sargon to undertake numerous monumental building projects, ranging from the erection of statues of himself on the shores of the Mediterranean to the construction of new palaces and even entire new cities. These included not only his new capital of Akkad, but also, supposedly, the legendary city of Babylon, or at least a very early iteration of that city. The whole system functioned reasonably well as long as imperial power remained strong enough to deter or crush any acts of rebellion. But any hint of weakness or instability, and local elites would withhold taxes, forge competing alliances, or even declare independence outright. It was a system that demanded constant vigilance and the implementation of brutal reprisals for any sign of disobedience. Among Sargon's most troublesome subjects throughout his long 56-year reign were the Sumerians. Despite his professed respect for their culture and traditions, the city-states of Sumer were in an almost constant state of rebellion against his rule, and they were far from alone. Practically every conquered territory fought to overthrow Akkadian rule at one time or another. Year after year, Sargon was compelled to prove his legitimacy as king by playing a massive game of whack-a-mole across his vast empire, putting down uprisings and reconquering city-state after city-state. This is all the more remarkable when you consider the distances involved. Forced marches lasting days or even weeks must have been commonplace. For the next 2,000 years, Mesopotamians would tell tales of the kings who dared to rise up against Sargon of Akkad and of his glorious victories over them, often quoting Sargon's own words from his supposed autobiography. "In my old age, all the lands revolted against me, and they besieged me in Akkad. But the old lion still had his teeth and claws. I went forth to battle and defeated them. I knocked them over and destroyed their vast army. Now, any king who wants to call himself my equal, let him go wherever I went." Upon Sargon's death in 2278 BC, the entire empire erupted in revolt. Most of these revolts were suppressed by his son and successor, Remush, who reigned for 9 years before reportedly being assassinated by his own court. He was followed by another of Sargon's sons, Manishtushu, who reigned for 15 years and is perhaps best known for having fought a sea battle against 32 kings who had banded together to oppose him. Manishtushu's son and successor, Naram-Sin, was the last great Akkadian ruler. He expanded the borders of the empire even further than Sargon's conquests and left behind a famous stele commemorating his victory over the Lulubai, a fearsome hill tribe from the Zagros Mountains. In the religious arena, he outdid Sargon by appointing several of his daughters as high priestesses of prominent cults throughout Mesopotamia. Naram-Sin was also the first Near Eastern ruler to declare himself a living god, which he did after crushing a major rebellion across Mesopotamia. Or, as the inscription puts it, when the four corners were hostile to him, he remained victorious in 9 battles in a single year because of the love Ishtar bore for him. Because he had been able to preserve his city in a time of crisis, the inhabitants asked that he be made the god of their city, Akkad. All later inscriptions show the name of Naram-Sin preceded by the cuneiform sign derived from the image of a star, the Sumerian symbol of godhood. An old Mesopotamian myth recounts that the goddess Inanna abandoned the city of Akkad following Naram-Sin's plunder of the temple of Enlil at Nippur. In his fury, Enlil unleashed the Gutians from their homeland in the Zagros Mountains to bring plague, famine, and death across Mesopotamia. To avert this destruction, 8 of the gods decreed that the city of Akkad should be destroyed to spare the remaining cities. While this story may be mythological, it does reflect the fact that Gutian raids had become a serious concern under Naram-Sin's rule. During the reign of his son, Shar-Kali-Shari, the combination of internal revolts and external conflicts was finally driving the Akkadian Empire toward complete collapse. Interestingly, this collapse roughly coincides with the fall of the Egyptian Old Kingdom, which we'll be discussing in the next episode. It's been theorized that decreasing rainfall and a resulting severe drought in the eastern Mediterranean might have played a significant role in the downfall of both civilizations. In Mesopotamia, crops and animals, and eventually people, began to perish, with many of the survivors becoming desperate refugees, flooding into cities whose irrigation-based agricultural systems could no longer sustain them. Whatever environmental factors may have been at play, the final nail in the Akkadian coffin was clear. In 2154 BC, the empire suffered a massive invasion by the Gutians. The capital of Akkad was utterly destroyed. Centralized rule disintegrated almost immediately, and the entire territory reverted back to a patchwork of independent states. Many of these states fell under Gutian rule, while some, like Lagash, continued to flourish under local dynasties. The best-known Sumerian ruler of the Gutian period was Gudea, the Ensi of Lagash, who presided over a brief golden age of art and literature in his city. The Elamite king, Kutik-in-Shushinak, took advantage of this power vacuum to declare independence from Akkad, throwing off the Akkadian language for good measure and reinstating the short-lived Proto-Elamite script. Kutik-in-Shushinak went on to conquer the nearby cities of Susa and Anshan, and appears to have achieved some degree of political unity for a time. However, following his reign, the Awan dynasty also crumbled. In most other regions, the post-Akkadian period was so chaotic that the Sumerian king list literally cries out in exasperation. Who was king? Who was not king? The Gutians proved to be poor rulers, too unaccustomed to the complexities of civilization to organize and maintain its most vital components. This was especially true of the Mesopotamian network of canals, which was allowed to fall into disrepair, with the predictable consequence of widespread famine and death. Around 2100 BC, King Utuhegal of Uruk finally managed to drive the Gutians out of Mesopotamia. His brother and successor, Ur-Nammu, went on to restore Sumerian-Akkadian political unity under the Third Dynasty of Ur, typically abbreviated as Ur-III. This new empire, ethnically a blend of Sumerians and Akkadians, but which I'll call Akkadia for simplicity's sake, was smaller but more centrally organized than the old Akkadian Empire. It consisted of two distinct parts: the heartland of Sumer and Akkad, governed by parallel civil and military administrations, and a militarily controlled zone to the east between the Tigris and the Zagros Mountains. Essentially, the Elamite heartland. Beyond this zone lay the rest of the Near East, where either diplomatic contacts were maintained or where the armies of Akkadia raided. The Ur-III dynasty has left us with an enormous trove of written records, covering military campaigns and building activity, as well as hymns celebrating the great deeds of their kings. Shulgi, one of the longest reigning and most influential Ur-III rulers, had the following written about him in glowing first person. To my delight, the god Enlil spoke favorably about me, and they gave me the scepter because of my righteousness. I placed my foot on the neck of the foreign lands. The fame of my weapons is established. The clay bullets, the treacherous pellets that I shoot, fly around like a violent rainstorm. In my rage, I do not let them miss. At the same time as Akkadian poets were perfecting the ancient art of sucking up, Ur-III rulers were also taking early stabs at the art of diplomacy. Even under Ur-III domination, Elam was still a regional power, and King Shusin gave one of his daughters in marriage to a prince of Anshan, the new Elamite capital, in an attempt to bind the lands more closely through blood. Despite this gesture, Elam continued to chafe under the Akkadian yoke, always on the lookout for an opportunity to regain its independence. Toward the end of Ur-III, large numbers of Amorite immigrants from the west had also begun to pose an existential threat to the very nature of Akkadian society. The threat was deemed serious enough that Shusin was compelled to construct a 170-mile-long wall from the Tigris to the Euphrates to forestall the virtual invasion. They probably also had Akkadian Minutemen on ancient lawn chairs keeping a watchful eye on the border. The Amorites at the time were organized into semi-nomadic clans, ruled by fierce tribal chiefs who forced their way into lands they needed to graze their herds. Akkadian literature often speaks disparagingly of the Amorites, viewing their nomadic way of life with disgust and contempt. according to one tract. The Amorite, he is dressed in sheepskins. He lives in tents, in wind and rain. He doesn't offer sacrifices. An armed vagabond of the steppe, he digs up truffles and is restless. He eats raw meat, lives his life without a home, and when he dies, he is not buried according to proper rituals. I know it's pretty strong stuff, but I thought you needed to hear it. I'm guessing the Amorites were also accused of being lazy while simultaneously stealing all the good Akkadian jobs. Ah, progress. A recurring theme of Mesopotamian history is the almost continuous pattern of immigration by desert nomads and hill tribes, all considered backward, uncouth barbarians by the dominant civilization, before being slowly assimilated into Sumerian culture, only to look down their noses at the next wave of newcomers. Ironically, many of these immigrant tribes, including the Amorites, Kassites, and Chaldeans, would go on to form strong local dynasties that would preserve and defend Sumerian culture against even greater threats to its existence. A loose comparison can be made between the Sumerians, Akkadians, and desert nomads, and the Greeks, Romans, and barbarians beyond their frontiers. The first group provided the dominant cultural template. The second, the military strength to both spread the culture and defend it against invaders, with the third group constantly pushing against the borders and either asking or demanding to be let in and share the wealth. Fortunately for Rome, she had actual defensible geographic frontiers to defend, primarily rivers and virtually impassable deserts. Mesopotamia, in contrast, has no natural boundaries, and its fertile land and wealthy cities were perpetually vulnerable to attacks and invasions from the constantly abundant warlike peoples in the surrounding areas were a persistent threat. As time passed, the centralized structure of UR3's domination began to crumble, and the regions that made it up started to reclaim their independence. This was due to a multitude of factors, including elevated grain prices caused by a string of poor harvests, and the empire's increasing struggle to gather taxes from its more distant provinces. At this point, despite Shushan's impressive Great Wall, the Amorites had managed to infiltrate Mesopotamia so deeply that they became integrated into every layer of Akkadian society. Some Amorites exploited the escalating chaos to grab local power. There was never a clear-cut Amorite invasion, nothing like the Gutian invasion that brought the old Akkadian Empire to its knees. However, Amorites did seize control of several key cities during that period, including Isin, Larsa, and Babylon. But the final, decisive blow for Ur came from the east when King Kandatu of Shamashki finally succeeded in overthrowing the empire's control of the Elamite heartland. In 2004 BC, he commanded the liberated Elamite armies into Mesopotamia, captured the magnificent city of Ur, and imprisoned King Ibisin in Susa, effectively ending the Third Dynasty. Ur was subjected to 7 years of occupation before King Ishbi-Era of Isin, an Amorite successor state to Ur, eventually managed to expel the Elamites from the city. The following centuries would be characterized by ongoing warfare between Amorite and Elamite successor kingdoms, a topic we'll delve into in next week's podcast. In the span of just 200 years, the Akkadian Empire taught the world what a multi-ethnic empire was, what large-scale warfare looked like, and what a spectacular collapse felt like. Yet, Sargon's vision, the unified empire, remained, deeply influencing the subsequent Babylonian and Assyrian dynasties.